Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going deep on a text that you might not expect to be super relevant to international relations.
Yeah.
But trust me on this one, we're diving into Aristotle's politics.
Yeah, and you might be thinking Aristotle for international relations, really. But his work, even though it focuses on city-states, actually has a lot of insights into politics and power and stability. Things that are really helpful for anyone studying international relations, especially if you're gearing up for the UPSC exam.
And it's almost like a secret weapon, right? Bringing Aristotle into the UPSC IR exam.
Yeah, nobody expects that, right? And the thing is, even though he was writing thousands of years ago, his observations about, human behavior and why we have conflict and this yearning for stability, it's all incredibly timeless.
Yeah. Okay, so let's get into some of these timeless insights. One of the things that really stood out to me was how Aristotle viewed revolution. And he had a very different take on it than his teacher, Plato. Plato saw change, especially like radical change, as a bad thing, like a sign of decay. But Aristotle, he saw it as something much more complex.
Yeah, and potentially even positive.
Right, exactly.
And that's a super important difference. It's kind of at the core of how Aristotle saw the world. He believed that change was inevitable. In fact, he thought it was necessary for societies to grow and kind of move towards what he called their final cause.
Final cause.
Hmm.
I'm going to need you to unpack that one for me.
Yeah.
What exactly is a final cause?
Yeah, so it's not really about mysticism or anything. It's more about Aristotle's idea that everything in nature has this built-in purpose.
Yeah.
Like there's a goal that it's trying to reach, It's kind of like, think about an acorn, right?
Mm.
Its final cause is to become an oak tree. It's like it's in its nature to grow in that way. So when it comes to a society, that final cause is like its best possible form.
Okay, got it. So revolution, as messy as it might be, could actually be like a step forward.
Right. A step toward that ideal state.
Okay, so let's bring this back to our UPSC folks. Think about how this view of revolution could apply to international relations. Countries are always changing, sometimes peacefully, sometimes not. But if you can understand the motivations behind the change, whether it's, wanting more equality or a shift in power, or maybe just a reaction to some big event, you can analyze those changes on a much deeper level.
Totally. That's how you go from just listing facts to really understanding the why behind the what. And that's what sets apart a good IR analysis from, a truly great one.
Okay, so Aristotle saw revolution as sometimes a good thing. But he wasn't naive about it. He categorized the causes of revolution into 3 buckets. And they're super interesting even today.
Yeah, let's dig into those categories.
Okay, so first up, psychological motives. Aristotle realized that people are driven by things like wanting equality, or sometimes, and this is interesting, wanting inequality.
Right. It's like sometimes people revolt because they're being oppressed or left out. They want a fairer system. But sometimes revolutions happen because people are power hungry, right? They want to be on top. So you have to look at that whole range of human motivations.
That makes sense. And then you have a second category, objectives. Aristotle said that often revolutions are sparked by people going after things like profit, honor, even fear.
These are very real and powerful motivators. Think about economic inequality or the fight for resources or the fear of losing your status or your security. These can drive individuals, groups, even whole nations to act.
Right. And then finally, his third category, specific events. He saw that sometimes it's just one event, a spark that sets everything off.
Yeah, it could be anything from like a government decision that people hate, or a natural disaster, or an economic crash. It's that thing that pushes people over the edge from grumbling to actually revolting.
Okay, so we've got the 3 categories: psychological motives, objectives, and specific events.
Yeah.
And here's where it gets interesting for those of you prepping for the UPSC.
How so?
Because those categories, they don't just apply to revolutions within countries. They can help us understand conflict and change on the global stage, too.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Yeah. Think about it. A country might make foreign policy decisions because they want more global power, right? That's psychological. Or they might start a war to secure resources. That fits into objectives. Or maybe a border dispute suddenly explodes into a huge conflict. That's your specific event.
That's a brilliant connection.
So if you understand what drives change, you start to see patterns. You see the motivations behind what countries do. And that's like pure gold for anyone studying international relations.
It really is. It helps you go beyond just saying what happened to
Yeah.
explaining why it happened. That kind of deep thinking. That's what really impresses those UPSC examiners.
Okay, so we've talked about Aristotle's view on revolution, but there's another idea of his that I think is especially relevant to what's going on in the world today. He talked about how a disproportionate increase in one part of the state could cause a revolution.
Yeah, this is where Aristotle's work feels incredibly modern. He noticed that when one group or one part of society gains too much power, it throws everything off balance and can lead to instability.
And we see this playing out on the world stage all the time.
All the time. Think about the rise of new superpowers, or older ones declining, or the shifts in economic power, or even new technologies that give some countries an edge. These are all examples of disproportionate increases that disrupt things and, yeah, could even lead to conflict.
It's like he predicted our anxieties about things like China's rise, or the shifting dynamic between the U.S. and other countries, or even the race to have the best technology. It's all about maintaining this delicate balance of power.
Right. Which leads us to another key insight from Aristotle, maybe one of his biggest contributions, his focus on mixed constitutions and the importance of the rule of law. Now, these ideas, even though he was talking about city-states, they have huge implications for how we understand international relations today.
Oh, so we're going to unpack those next. I'm really curious to hear how those ideas about mixed constitutions and the rule of law can help us make sense of the world today, especially for all those future diplomats out there who are getting ready for the UPSC.
I think that's a great place to start when we come back. So before the break, we were about to dig into Aristotle's ideas about mixed constitutions and the rule of law, and how those ideas, apply to international relations.
Yeah, let's get into that. So remind me, what did Aristotle actually mean by mixed constitution?
Well, Aristotle, he wasn't a big fan of extremes, right? He thought that pure democracies could turn into mob rule pretty easily, and pure oligarchies, where only the rich and powerful were in charge, those were unstable too, because they just created, resentment and rebellion.
Ah, so he was looking for that sweet spot, that balance.
Right. He called this ideal system a polity. And in a polity, you've got elements of both democracy and oligarchy, but they're mixed in a way that that keeps any one group from becoming too powerful. It's about checks and balances.
Okay, interesting. So how did he see this working in the real world?
Well, Aristotle believed that a strong middle class was crucial for a stable polity. He thought a big middle class would kind of act as a buffer between the very wealthy and the very poor.
Right, so they would help prevent things from getting too polarized, right? Which could lead to unrest.
Exactly. And this whole concept of a mixed constitution, with its focus on balance and sharing power, well, it's had a huge influence on how we structure governments today. Think about the U.S. with its, separation of powers, or the parliamentary systems you see in a lot of Europe.
Wow. So you're saying that ideas that Aristotle developed for like ancient Greek city-states are actually reflected in how we organize governments on a global scale.
It's pretty amazing, right? It shows you how powerful some of his ideas were. And if we take this a step further and apply it to international relations, we can see how the concept of a mixed constitution shows up in organizations like the UN.
Oh, the UN, I see what you're saying. The UN is all about bringing countries together, countries with different levels of power to try to, work together.
Right. You've got the Security Council with its permanent members and the rotating members. It's trying to find that balance between, the influence of a few really powerful countries and the interests of a wider range of countries. Is it perfect? No. But it's trying to achieve that same kind of balance that Aristotle was talking about.
It's like creating a global polity.
Exactly. Okay, so we've got mixed constitutions, but Aristotle also placed a ton of importance on the rule of law. He saw it as the foundation of a just and stable society, both within a state and this is key, in how states interact with each other.
Okay, but how does the rule of law, which usually refers to laws inside a country, how does that apply to international relations? There's no global police force, right?
That's a great question. You're right. It's a challenge. But the rule of law in international relations is about setting up a system where countries are accountable to rules and norms that, they've all agreed on, even if there isn't a global cop to enforce them.
Okay, so what keeps countries in line then? What stops them from just doing whatever they want?
Well, that's where things get a bit complicated. We've got treaties and conventions and this thing called customary international law, these set standards for how countries are supposed to act. And we have international courts like the International Court of Justice or the International Criminal Court. Those courts can, settle disputes and hold individuals or even countries accountable for breaking international law.
So it's about creating this framework of rules, even if enforcing them is sometimes difficult.
Exactly. And for you, as UPSC aspirants, understanding these ins and outs of international law, its strengths and weaknesses, well, it's really important if you're going to analyze global conflicts or, figure out how treaties work or understand how foreign policy is made.
It's all super relevant to those of you studying for that international relations paper.
It really is. And it's worth remembering that even though the rule of law is this, this powerful concept, it's not perfect. There are ways to get around it. And we see times when countries break international law or find loopholes.
Right, right. And that's where critical thinking is so important. It's not enough to know the rules. You also have to be able to analyze how you're actually being used, where they work and where they fail.
Exactly. And that brings us back to Aristotle. His ideas, as old as they are, give us this framework for understanding why countries do what they do and the importance of balance in the world and this ongoing struggle to create a just and stable world order.
It's amazing how we've been able to connect these ideas from like way back then to the problems we're facing in the world today. It's like Aristotle is giving us advice across centuries, helping us make sense of things.
I think he'd be happy to know that people are still debating and discussing his work today. So what's been the most interesting part for you so far? What's really stuck with you?
It really stood out to me how much emphasis Aristotle put on really understanding human nature. He got it. He understood that political systems, whether it's in a city-state or on the global level, they're ultimately about, dealing with the complexity of human motivation, our desires, our fears, our sense of justice. It's all connected.
You're so right. He wasn't just interested in theories. He wanted to see how those theories played out in the real world, in people's lives, in the fate of nations. That's why his work is still so powerful, even as we deal with, these global challenges that he could have never imagined.
So where do we go from here? We've covered a lot. Aristotle's views on revolution, his ideas about mixed constitutions, and the rule of law. What's next in our exploration?
Well, I think it's time to move from, what causes instability to what Aristotle thought we could do about it. He didn't just want to identify the problems, he also wanted to find solutions. And I think some of his suggestions might surprise you.
Okay, so we're back and ready to get into Aristotle's solutions for preventing revolution. I know you might be thinking, this is all very theoretical, right? How can some philosopher from ancient Greece help me understand international relations today? But believe me, Aristotle was all about putting theory into practice.
Yeah, he wasn't just thinking about these things in the abstract. He was watching how people behaved, how power worked in the real world. And with revolution, he wasn't just trying to figure out why it happened. He actually wanted to find ways to stop it from happening.
Okay, well, let's hear it then. What were some of his big ideas for keeping things stable, both within states and maybe, between countries too?
Well, one of his, I guess you could say, core beliefs was that justice was the key. He argued that when people feel like the system is rigged against them, when they see injustice all around them, well, that's when you start to get resentment. And that's how revolutions start.
So basically, if you want stability, you need a just system.
That was definitely Aristotle's view. He believed that leaders had this responsibility to create a system where everyone felt like they had a fair shot, where the laws were applied equally and where everyone, not just the select few, had opportunities to get ahead.
That sounds a lot like, the principles behind modern democracies and even international organizations like the UN.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? The idea that everyone should have a voice, that power shouldn't be in the hands of just a small group. That's all very much rooted in Aristotle's philosophy.
Okay, so justice is important, but did he have any more concrete suggestions, any actual advice for leaders who wanted to prevent these kinds of upheavals?
He did, and some of his ideas are surprisingly practical. Like, for instance, he told rulers to be careful about getting too rich because it could make people envious and resentful. And he was a big believer in education. He thought that if people were educated, they'd be less likely to fall for, bad leaders or dangerous ideas.
So it's not just about the system being fair. It's also about people having the right values, the right mindset.
Exactly. And this is where I think Aristotle is especially relevant to international relations. In a world where countries are always competing for power and influence, there's this huge temptation to just look out for yourself.
Yeah, we see that all the time, unfortunately.
And Aristotle would say that real stability doesn't come from dominating others. It comes from cooperation, from creating a system where all countries, no matter how big or small, feel like they have a part to play. They have something to gain.
It's like instead of this winner-take-all approach, it's more about shared responsibility and everyone benefiting.
Exactly. And this idea that a just and stable society, whether it's a city-state or the global community, is built on shared values, mutual respect, and fairness. That's one of Aristotle's most important contributions, I think.
Wow. I can see how these ideas, even though they're old, can help us understand what's happening in the world today. It's almost like he's giving us a guide for building a better world, a more peaceful world.
And for all of you listening who are preparing for the UPSC, especially that international relations paper, think about how these ideas from Aristotle play out in how countries interact with each other. Think about issues like, climate change or global trade or humanitarian crises. Are we cooperating? Are we working together based on shared values? Or is it more about competition and just looking out for number one?
Those are some great questions to think about. They really show how relevant these ideas still are. So I guess to wrap things up, what's the big takeaway here? What should our listeners, especially those future diplomats and IR experts, what should they remember from our deep dive into Aristotle's politics?
I think the most important thing to remember is that if you want to understand politics, whether it's inside a country or between countries, you have to understand human nature. Aristotle understood this. Our desires, our fears, our ideas about justice, they're all driving forces behind conflict and cooperation. And if we can understand these things about ourselves, then we can start to build a world that is more just, more stable, more peaceful.
And that's a goal we should all be striving for. So if you're studying for the UPSC, don't underestimate Aristotle. His politics, even though it's an old text, has this timeless wisdom that can help you really understand what's happening in the world. It can help you see things in a new light.
And remember, understanding these concepts, it's not just about passing an exam. It's about becoming a more informed, more engaged global citizen.
And that's what this deep dive has been all about. Thanks for joining us. If you found it helpful, please subscribe and share it with your friends. And keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep trying to understand the world around you.